comprehensive representation of what goes into the real exchange rate. Now let's go step by step. The first thing is, this variable here is the logarithm of the terms of trade. Now the terms of trade I define as the domestic price of imported goods relative to the domestic price of exported goods. Now this is the price of footballs in head country. This is what's imported. This is in domestic currency, and this is the price of what we export. The home country exports good H in the football country, and it has to be translated into the same currency by using the nominal exchange rate. Now the terms of trade is a relative price of two different things. How much do you pay for your imports relative what partners pay for your exports? I know that sometimes people define it the other way around. They say the terms of trade is export prices over import prices. Whenever you meet the terms of trade, be careful that you know how it's denoted. But importantly, this is about a relative price of different goods. Hat price versus football price. Now, this is greater than 0 if there is a home bias in consumption. Now, what is a home bias in consumption? Home bias exists if you devote a larger share of your consumption bundle to stuff that's produced domestically. So that would mean that Germans devote a larger share of their consumption bundle to potatoes because potatoes are grown in large quantities in Germany. And Vietnamese people devote a larger share of their consumption to rice because rice is more, there is, as I've been told, there are potatoes in Vietnam, but rice is, I think, more prominent. Now, in this case, if the people in hat country devote a larger share of their consumption to hats than people in football country, so both populations like hats and footballs, but the hat people particularly like hats, and the football countries devote a larger share of their consumption to footballs, then this is positive. Now, if both countries have identical consumption bundles, theta H is equal to theta F, and the difference is 0. Now, importantly, you see that the terms of trade have an impact on the real exchange rate if there is a home bias in consumption. If theta H differs from theta F, then any movement in the terms of trade has an impact on the real exchange rate. Conversely, if you have identical consumption baskets, then there may be variations in the terms of trade, but they have no effect on the real exchange rate. Now the next thing to look at is this. These are deviations from the law of one price for good F and for good H. Now please note, here we're talking about the same good and the price of the same good in different countries. The terms of trade, and this is often confused, the terms of trade talk about the relative price of two different goods. Here we talk about the price of the football in football country, and here we talk about the price of the football in hat country. Of course, this is foreign currency, this is domestic currency, so we need the nominal exchange rate to translate things into the same currency. Here we talk about the hat price in football country, and here we have the hat price in hat country. So we're talking about differences in price for the same things, which is not the same as the terms of trade because we're talking about the same thing. Finally, and that is something that you've seen before, we have these relative price of non-traded goods, or the price of non-traded goods relative to the price of traded goods in countries H and F. Okay? So this is, right, this is not a theory, it's just, the assumptions on the on how these consumption bundles are structured, and then by juggling around with that, we get this expression. Now, why is that important? Well, it gives us, first of all, ideas about what's moving the real exchange rate, and secondly, it gives us ideas about why the exchange rate might be considered a measure of price competitiveness. So the first thing is, What is driving the fluctuations of the real exchange rate can be driven by variations of the price of non-traded goods relative to the price of traded goods. The Balassa-Samuelson model, what we did this morning, right? If PN over PT in the home country goes up and everything else stays the same, then the real exchange rate goes down, so we have a real appreciation. That's the first thing potentially driving the real exchange rate. Secondly, we have variations of the terms of trade, which I define as the price of imported goods relative to the price of exported goods. Now let me make two remarks. First of all, the terms of trade may fluctuate due to fundamental factors. Supply-demand conditions on world markets. You export rice, all of a sudden the entire world wants to have rice, driving up the price of your export good. You export cars, all of a sudden nobody wants to have your cars, pushing down the price of your export goods. So there's a lot of terms of trade are driven by fundamental factors, but also by other things. So the terms of trade might fluctuate due to fundamental factors, but also due to nominal exchange rate fluctuations combined with sticky prices. More about this later. Now the terms of trade has a monetary component and a fundamental component, which doesn't make life easier. Now, the blue thing says fluctuations of the terms of trade are associated with fluctuations of the real exchange rate if the composition of the T goods bundle differs across countries. That is, if theta H differs from theta F. Conversely, if theta H equals theta F, then you may have the terms of trade fluctuate like mad, but you don't see it in the real exchange rate because it enters both countries' consumption bundles in the same way. You need that asymmetry in consumption bundles. Now, please note that this morning, I made a big fuss about emphasizing that for absolute purchasing power parity, you need the same consumption bundles. Home bias in consumption is a deviation from that principle. So we shouldn't be surprised by if there's a home bias in consumption, that all of a sudden PPP doesn't hold any longer because we don't have the same consumption bundles. Finally, the fluctuations of the real exchange rate can be driven by time-variant deviations from the law of one price for individual tradable goods. For example, due to time-variant trade costs, tariffs, right? Or due to fluctuations of the nominal exchange rate combined with sticky prices. Now, when you ask a central banker, you're no central bankers, not yet, maybe you will be. When you ask a central banker what is driving the real exchange rate, the instinctive reply is, well, it's sticky prices plus the nominal exchange rate. So nominal exchange rate fluctuating and sticky prices fixing prices. Now, the important thing to note is this is not wrong, but it's not the only thing we have to know. And because you may have deviations from the law of one price. Suppose you fix this and you fix that. Then, and it cannot change in the short run, then any change in the nominal exchange rate has an effect on the nominal, generates deviations from the law of one price and results in movements in the real exchange rate, right? But sticky prices plus nominal exchange rate fluctuations are not the only thing giving rise to to deviations from the law of one price. That's my point. You may have time-variant trade costs, and you get also time-variant deviations from the LOP, which have nothing to do with monetary policy. So this is the important thing. You have real and fundamental causes of variations in Q. So you have variations in relative prices, non-tradables, tradables, terms of trade. So, okay, now let me start over. What's driving the real exchange rate? Well, it may be real factors or fundamental factors, something that has to do with the structure of the economy, with the structure of supply and demand, with scarcities, preferences, productivities, and this may enter the real exchange rate. So there are people talking about the real exchange rate without even mentioning money. They are all kind of talking about these real factors. Secondly, there may be fluctuations in the real exchange rate that are monetary in nature. And in this case, you have variations in the nominal exchange rate which are driving Q due to delayed price adjustments, so-called sticky prices. Now, for fundamental factors, we have, this likely to be permanent. For sticky price, for monetary factors, it's likely to be temporary. It goes away over time. In economic models, we focus on individual causes of relative real exchange rate fluctuations. In reality, these different forces coexist. And it's not easy to disentangle them, right? But, life isn't easy. That's the way it is. And so we have to know that. So let me conclude by taking a closer look at the terms of trade. Now, we define the terms of trade as the domestic currency price of imported goods relative to the price of exported goods. So this is Q tot terms of trade. So we have the domestic currency price of the good imported by country H. So that's the football price in head country. And we divide by the domestic currency price of the good produced and exported by country H, the head country price, the head price in head country. So we're referring to the same, we're referring to different goods, F and H, but we're referring to the same location. Now, we can write this in different ways. Either we write it this way, PFH times PHF times E. So here you have the foreign currency price of the good exported by country H, and you multiply that by the nominal exchange rate to translate it into the same currency. Or we may write this as Q tot. So this is the foreign currency price of the imported good, and this is the domestic currency price of the exported good. And we turn that foreign currency price into domestic currency. Now, what the heck is this good for? The answer is, later on when we talk about the role of the nominal exchange rate, we will see that whether a nominal exchange rate depreciation moves the terms of trade in this or another direction very much depends on firms' pricing strategies. Now, there's one thing that we call producer currency pricing, where firms price the good that they produce in their own currency, and then the nominal exchange rate translates it into a foreign currency. That would be this. And there's another thing that's called local currency pricing, where firms price the good that they produce in the customer's currency. So suppose you're producing something and you're not pricing it in Vietnamese dong, but you produce it for the European market and you price it in euros. That would be this case. And you see, in this case, the nominal exchange rate is in the denominator. Here it's in the numerator. That's something that would be important later on. Now, remarks. Some authors define the terms of trade the other way around, price of exports relative to price of imports. That's just, you have to know how it's defined, but once you know, then it's not, you have to get used to it. Here we assume which goods are imported and which goods are exported is considered as exogenous. This is important, right? Because trade economists, I made that remark shortly before the lunch break, that trade economists hate the Armington assumption. Do you know what Hong Kong's main export good was in the 1970s? What did Hong Kong export in the 1970s?
Electronic goods.
Pardon? Movies? Yeah, Bruce Lee movies? Yeah, okay. No, but Hong Kong was known in Europe as producer of cheap stuff. So the stuff when you went to the local festival and you participated in a lottery and you didn't win a big prize but you won a small prize, you got a little plastic thing, and usually what you saw on the back was made in Hong Kong. Right? That was Hong Kong in the 1970s, producing cheap stuff. There was even, you got something that didn't look very high quality and you said, is this made in Hong Kong? Guess what, right? Now, why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because the export pattern of Hong Kong has changed big time, right? Hong Kong has moved from producing cheap plastic stuff, toys and whatever, into a producer of more or less high quality stuff. So the arming consumption denies that. It kind of locks countries into producing certain things forever. This is what's so problematic about the arming consumption. Turkey is also a country that's moving up the quality ladder big time. And this, by the way, is also what the Vietnamese government wants to see about Vietnam. Turkey used to produce, or the best case is China. What did China produce some 30 years ago? And now they produce cars that actually, the electric vehicles can compete with the German cars. So the arming consumption is essentially problematic because it denies the possibility that countries' trade patterns change. But it's underlying this thing. Now, importantly, if there is a home bias in consumption, an increase of the terms of trade is associated with a real depreciation, and a decrease of the terms of trade is associated with a real appreciation. Now let me show that again. Right, here we have that equation. Now, if the terms of trade increase, and this is positive, then the real exchange rate goes up as well. So the terms of trade going up is associated with a real depreciation. The terms of trade going down is associated with the real appreciation. Why is this important? Well, because the terms of trade are relevant. Now, with our definition, an increase of the terms of trade is sometimes called a worsening of the terms of trade. Reason is, an increase of terms of trade implies that more units of the exported good have to be exchanged for 1 unit of the imported good. Right? If the terms of trade increase, if the relative price of imports over exports goes up, then imports become expensive and exports become cheap. And you have an improvement of the terms of trade if the terms of trade decrease, because then imports become cheap and exports become expensive. Now, the big question is, do you want to see a worsening or an improvement of the terms of trade? Well, the terminology suggests that an improvement of the terms of trade is better than a worsening. Because you want to sell the stuff that you're producing at high prices and buy the stuff that you're importing at low prices. Now, store that in a safe place, and let me move to the lower part of the slide. At the same time, an increase of the terms of trade is often interpreted as a gain of price competitiveness, and a decrease of the terms of trade is often interpreted as a loss of price competitiveness. We're looking at two sides of the same coin. The reason is, an increase of the terms of trade implies that the exported good becomes cheaper relative to the imported good, and a decrease of the terms of trade implies that the exported good becomes more expensive relative to the imported good. Now, we have the same movement, right? The terms of trade going up, and then we have some people say, oh, that's super good, and some people say that's super bad. The people who say that's super good say, if the imported price becomes high and the export relative to the exported price, our exports are more competitive, and we're going to sell more stuff abroad and buy less stuff from abroad. Now, a trade economist would say, wait a minute. When the terms of trade go up, the imported goods become more expensive. The exported stuff becomes less expensive. So you have to give away more of what you produce and export for what you import. That can't be good. And this is something that is rarely addressed, kind of almost schizophrenic perspective on the same thing. Now let me conclude, and then I'll really let you go. What is the bottom line? There's a seemingly contradictory these seemingly contradictory normative perspectives are two sides of the same coin. In neoclassical situation where you have full employment in which aggregate output is determined by aggregate supply, you want to get a lot of imports for your exports. That is, you want to reduce your terms of trade. You want them to improve, quote unquote. In the trade literature, if imports become cheap and exports become expensive, that's an improvement of the terms of trade. Why? Well, because full employment is never an issue in trade models. These are usually full employment models. So aggregate demand is not an issue because it's just there. So you want to sell your stuff expensively, you want to import that stuff that you import cheaply. That's the point. Now in macro models, in a Keynesian situation, you have underemployment. You have a situation where you want to have aggregate demand to pick up. Now how do you make aggregate demand pick up? Well, you have foreigners who want to buy your stuff. How do you make foreigners want to buy your stuff? Your stuff is cheap. How do you prevent domestic residents from buying foreign stuff? You make foreign stuff expensive. So what the trade economists consider an improvement in the terms of trade is considered by macroeconomists a loss in price competitiveness. And what trade economists would consider a worsening of the terms of trade, macroeconomists would declare a gain in price competitiveness. This is not that we have to decide whether we are trade economists or macroeconomists. It's just that we have to be aware, is aggregate demand an issue? Is it really important to jumpstart aggregate demand? Are we in an underemployment situation? If so, then this may be the right perspective. If we are at full employment, then of course we want to sell our stuff expensively because to get more from abroad. Now this is deep stuff, right? It's not something that you digest within 5 minutes. You have to look at it over and over again. It is something that's often, you meet trade economists, they talk about the terms of trade improvements, terms of trade worsening. You meet macroeconomists, they talk about gains in price competitiveness, losses in price competitiveness. Often they talk about the same thing. And they just don't see that, they basically contradict each other. And me being an international macro person, I need the bird's eye view. And I want to convey to you. So I come back to this tomorrow because it's an important issue, and we'll continue right here. And thanks for giving me these additional 5 minutes, and thanks for the intense day. Okay, that's it. Thank you.